Welcome, everyone. My name is Cyril Brightman. I'm the director of the English language desk in Yad Vashem's International Relations Division. Our guest speaker today is Dr. David Silberklang, who is a senior historian at the Yad Vashem International Institute for Holocaust Research. He recently concluded 23 years as the editor of the scholarly journal Yad Vashem Studies, and he also teaches at the University of Haifa's Wise Livnat International MA program in Holocaust Studies, as well as at the Rothberg International School of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in addition to which he's been a visiting professor at various universities around the world. Dr. Silberklang represented Israel at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for 12 years, and is a member and chair of the Academic Working Group, a member of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, and numerous other steering committees and planning teams. Among his past functions at Yad Vashem, David was editor-in-chief of publications, series editor of the Holocaust Survivors Memoirs Projects, and chief historian of the Museum Development Project. In the last capacity, he wrote the extensive conceptual historical outline that served as the basis for the content of Yad Vashem's Holocaust History Museum. By the way, one of the exhibits in our museum is actually a film of Jan Karski talking, and of course, David's lecture will be on Jan Karski today. David has published widely on the Holocaust, and his book, Gates of Tears, The Holocaust in the Lublin District, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize in Holocaust Research. One of David's areas of expertise is Poland. Jan Karski was from Poland, so he certainly is an expert in that field. Over to you, please, David.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Cyril, and hello, everyone. So, yes, our subject is Jan Karski. I imagine many of you have heard of Jan Karski, but I want to get into some of the aspects of what was special and remarkable about this human being. Let me begin. I'll share a screen with you. I'll be going in and out of the screen. But let me share with you a number of things about Jan Karski. First of all, what did he look like, of course? I mean, this is Jan Karski around the time that he was on the mission that is at the heart of the talk today. This is at the end of World War II or just after. Jan Karski, in a more familiar image that you might know, and that is Jan Karski in the early 1980s when he was interviewed for the film Shoah, if I'm not mistaken about the date of that particular scene. Who was Jan Karski? And I'd like to begin with, first of all, Jan Karski is important to us because he was a Polish underground courier during World War II. But some of the background about this particular person: he was born in 1914 in the city of Łódź, as we know it in the Jewish world, and he died in the summer of 2000 in Washington, D.C. He was a very important, let's say, unusual person in the Polish scene of interwar Europe and wartime Poland. First of all, he was someone who was a lieutenant in the Polish reserves. As such, he was called up to the reserves, to the Polish army on the eve of World War II, literally August 31st, 1939, hours before the German invasion. He was called up. He was captured by the Soviets, actually, when they invaded Eastern Poland, and he was taken prisoner. He escaped the Soviet prisoner camp and got to the German side of the division of Poland between those two powers, and was in a German POW camp, escaped that as well, or was ultimately released. He joined the Polish underground and became a courier, and he brought a number of important features with him, characteristics with him, to the Polish underground that made him a very valuable member of the Polish underground. First of all, his education. I wrote here law and government. He was someone who had two university degrees, one in law and the other in government, or today we might call it political science. And that's an important element because he was someone who benefited from a continental European education, which in those days is something that gave anyone with that kind of education very broad knowledge in many fields and skills to analyze things in depth as well. And those analytical skills, together with training as a junior officer in the Army, gave him all sorts of skills that would be very valuable to any underground. This is in a society, as we know, that was largely agrarian at that time, where hardly anybody completed secondary school, let alone went to university. I think the percentage of Polish people who attended university in those days was somewhere in the vicinity of 3%. So he's really an intellectual elite with those kinds of skills. He also had great facility with languages. He was fluent not only in Polish, but in German, in French, and in English. He was able to get by quite well in various other Slavic languages. He could get by in Russian and Ukrainian and various other languages. And through the French, he was able to manage in other Romance languages, such as Spanish, which comes into play in the talk. On the eve of World War II, he was not only someone who was served as a lawyer and had a degree in government, but he was someone who had aspirations to serve his country as a diplomat. And in preparation for that, he had already done a kind of apprenticeship or internship in 2 different Polish embassies prior to World War II. He had served in Bern in Switzerland, and he had served in London, and in those places also sharpened his language skills in German, French in Switzerland, and in English when he was in London. So this is part of how he saw himself, and this diplomatic training also served him well when he went on his missions to the West, which we'll be discussing. He was also someone who was very athletic. He was tall for his time. He stood about 1.85 meters, more or less, say that's about 6'1" or a little bit more if you're talking in feet and inches, which nowadays for a Western European or a Central European or a North American male is not very tall. It's about average height, but we have to put ourselves into the context of the times in order to understand who and what we're talking about. So someone who stood 1.85 meters in Central or Eastern Europe in those days was someone who was physically head and shoulders above his peers, where the average height might have been about 1.72 meters for a male in Poland in those days or something like that. He's considerably taller, you know, the equivalent of a basketball player, or maybe a forward on the team. But it wasn't only his height, he was athletic. He was a candidate to be on the Polish Olympic team in equestrian sports, horseback riding, in the 1940 Olympics, the Olympics that of course never happened because of World War II. But he was such a good athlete at equestrian sports that he was a candidate for that. And anyone who's ever ridden a horse, I imagine that some people in the crowd have, knows that riding a horse is not just sitting there and letting the horse do all the work. It's a very demanding sport physically, on the arms, on the thighs, on the back, and you have to be able to control the horse to do what it is you want that horse to do, and so on. And in a country that was an agrarian country where everybody knows how to ride a horse, so for him to be a candidate for the Olympic team in those sports means that he's quite an athlete. But perhaps what made him, or the characteristic that he had that was most significant for his job as a courier, was the fact that he had a photographic memory, which meant that if he was sent on a mission to go between underground cells or something like that, he would commit whatever messages he was delivering back and forth to memory, and he could deliver them verbatim, which meant that if the enemy, the Nazis, were to capture him on a mission and they wanted to get information out of him, then the only way they could get information out of him was if they would torture him, which indeed happened at one point. And we'll get to that as well. Now, Karski, when I say he was in the underground, I want to clarify what I mean by that, because the Polish underground, like many undergrounds, had many different parts to it, many different branches. But the Polish underground that was loyal to the government in exile, the Polish government had fled Poland during the course of the invasion by Germany in September 1939 and ended up ultimately in London, They had several stops on the way, but ultimately, like most European governments in exile of the occupied countries, the Polish government in exile was in London. The loyal forces to the government in exile were composed primarily of a political underground state. That's what the Polish government and underground called themselves, an underground state that was represented by a delegate, someone appointed by the government who would head this underground state. And the job of the underground state, which was known in Polish as the delegatura, the delegate, and all those who worked with the delegate in the underground, their job was to try to hold Polish society together during this onslaught against it by the occupying forces, especially the German forces. Also against the Soviet forces, but mainly against the German forces, which were trying to dismantle Polish society as it was. So their job was to hold it together, and they were constantly reporting back through underground channels to the government in exile. Now, Karski's first mission to the government in exile took place already in February 1940. I mean, the war began only in September 39. He was a prisoner of war for a couple of months, and he got out of the prisoner of war camp and joined the nascent underground near the end of 1939. And in February 1940, he was already being sent to report to the government in exile. At that moment in time, when he was reporting to the government in exile, it had not yet reached London, and they were still based in France, in Anvers. So he went to France, I mean, from occupied Poland into France before the occupation of France. After he had traveled and taken notes and developed a long, detailed report that he was going to present from the two different main occupation zones. That is, he visited the Soviet occupation zone and traveled around and listened to what people were talking about and talked to local people to try to get a sense of what's going on. And of course, he traveled around the German occupation zone in Poland. And equipped with that, he went and reported to the government in exile. And I want to say a couple of things about what he had to say about Jews. Karski, before the war and during and since the war, was not known to be anyone who had any anti-Semitic sympathies whatsoever. He had Jewish friends and friends who were not Jewish, and he was a liberal. He was not known to have any kind of sentiments that were anti-Jewish in any way. His reports were, what does he see and what does he have to say about it? And his reports about Jews, particularly in the Soviet occupation zone, included some negative comments about how Jews are behaving. He said the Jews welcomed the Soviets. He said they welcomed the Soviets not because they're all communists, because they're not all communists. They welcomed the Soviets because they saw them as the lesser of two evils, he said. But in their behavior, some Jews, in the way they behaved in receiving the Soviets as with a sigh of relief, angered some of the local Polish people, and that was working against the Jews. So he had some comments about that. What about how local Polish people in both sides of the occupation areas were relating to Jews? And here, and this actually is in the context of him presenting his report about the German occupation zones. And he wrote, and this is just part of what he had to say, the attitude of the Jews toward the Poles is similar to their attitude toward the Germans, as they see them as unfriendly. Usually one gets the sense that it would be advisable, were there to prevail in the attitude of the Poles toward them, toward the Jews, the understanding that in the end, both peoples are being unjustly persecuted by the same enemy. Such an understanding does not exist among the broad masses of the Polish populace. Their attitude toward the Jews is overwhelmingly severe, often without pity. A large percentage of them are benefiting from the rights that the new situation gives them. The Poles were treated better than the Jews. They frequently exploit those rights and often even abuse them. This brings them to a certain extent nearer to the Germans. Although the nation loathes them, that is, the Polish nation loathes the Germans mortally, this question is creating something akin to a narrow bridge upon which the Germans and a large portion of Polish society are finding agreement. So Jan Karski, I'll stop that sharing for a moment. So Jan Karski, in reporting to the Polish government in exile or in February 1940, and he reported about many things. It's a long report. The Jews is just one piece of a larger report on many issues. But when he talks about Poles and how they relate to the Jews, he's saying there's a problem here. The Poles, in general, many Poles are dealing with the Jews negatively, and there's so much anti-Jewish sentiment among so many Poles that it's actually bringing them closer to the Germans rather than what they should be doing, he said. They should be looking at the Germans as the enemy of both the Jews and the Poles and ethnic Poles. And he saw that as a danger to Poland. His summary about all of that was, this is dangerous for Poland. We have to figure out how to deal with this. Now, Karski had a second mission later that year in 1940. Let me share the screen again and get into that. Later that year, he had a second mission. He was being sent again to the government in exile, and now the government in exile, once Germany had invaded the Western European countries, then the government in exile moved to London, and he was going to London. On the way, someone in the underground had turned him in. Someone was a double agent and turned him in, and he was captured by the Germans. And they took him to a special Gestapo torture center, and they tortured him, trying to get out of him the information, because they couldn't get, of course, much on his body because he remembered everything verbatim. He was afraid. Now, for such situations, the Polish underground had inserted in Karski's teeth and in the teeth of any courier, they had inserted cyanide poison in the teeth, so that if a courier felt that he was going to break under the torture, he could quickly take the cyanide out of his tooth, and swallow the cyanide and commit suicide, which he wanted to do. But the torture had at some point knocked him out, and he was unconscious. And during that time, the Germans had examined his teeth precisely looking for such a thing, and therefore he couldn't commit suicide with the cyanide. But he found a sharp implement, and he managed to cut his wrists. And the Germans came into the room where he was being held, and found him bleeding on the floor, and they rushed him to a military hospital, a German military hospital, where he was rescued and brought back to health. And that meant that now the Germans could torture him again. The Polish underground organized a rescue mission. The rescue mission was led by a man named Józef Cyrankiewicz, who might or might not be familiar to. Józef Cyrankiewicz in post-war Poland was one of the first, I think he was the first or one of the first presidents of Poland in post-war Poland. He was a leader of the socialist underground, on the left wing of the socialist underground. So he joined the new government after the war that was controlled by communists, but as a socialist, not as a communist. And of course, we know what happened in the history. The socialists kind of disappeared, and it became a communist regime ultimately. But someone who was that prominent, one of the leaders of the Socialist Party before the war, who was a leader of the socialist underground in Poland during the war, and who was so prominent that he became the president of Poland after the war, that's the man who led the rescue mission. And Karski was very proud to relate that. And he said that Cyrankiewicz told them they had orders to do one of two things, either to rescue him or to kill him, because he had too much sensitive information on him. Now, all this is very interesting. You know, he's already a remarkable person with all of these characteristics and the photographic memory and these missions and his observations. What does this have to do with the Holocaust, though, other than that early observation in February 1940? And that brings us to August, September of 1942. And before we go on with that, I want to put us in the context of the time of August, September 1942. In August 1942, the Polish underground, that delegatura, the political underground, decided to send Karski again on a mission to the West, to go to London, to report to the Polish government in exile. And Karski was someone who was viewed by all of the different political parties and factions in the underground, those that are loyal to the government. He was viewed as someone who was completely reliable and above politics. And therefore, we find this very unusual situation where every political party in the underground, the Democrats and the nationalists and the socialists and the peasant party, all sorts of parties that were together in this underground, came to Karski and gave him not only the mission to report on what's happening in Poland on behalf of like a national mission, but also gave him messages that were their party messages to their political party representatives who were sitting in as part of the government in London. So he would bring a report from the peasant party in Poland to the peasant party in London, from the Socialist Party in Poland to the Socialist Party in London. Not only the national report, but the particular party reports. Try to picture something like that happening. Now, here I am sitting in Israel. Can you picture in Israel, in those days or any day, someone from the Labor Party sending a message with someone else, to their labor, and at the same time, someone from Beitar going to the same person? You say, you give my message to Beitar. It's mind-boggling. You can't imagine something like that. You trust your own people, not somebody else. All of them trusted him. And that's already a statement about who this man was and how supremely reliable all of what was mainstream Poland, from right-wing nationalists to left-wing socialists, only the most extreme on the fringe are not part of this picture, trusted this man. So they're sending him on a mission to the West. Jews in the underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto, through their connections with Polish underground people, and this is in particular the connection between the Bund, the Jewish socialist, Yiddishist, anti-Zionist, anti-religious party, that was also, in terms of votes within the Jewish community on the eve of World War II, they were the largest Jewish political party on the eve of World War II in Poland. They had very good connections with the Socialist Party in Poland. Those connections brought information into the Warsaw Ghetto that a courier is about to go and bring messages to the Polish government in exile. So the Jewish underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto, at the end of the summer of 1942, hearing this, asked if they could meet this courier and give this courier Jewish messages to take to the very same people, to the Polish government in exile, to particular political parties, to the Western allies, et cetera, et cetera. And the underground agreed on condition that the courier would agree. And of course, the courier agreed. And then somewhere, apparently in September of 1942, Jan Karski met with two representatives of Jewish underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto in a safe house, a partially bombed out house on the outskirts of Warsaw that was used periodically by the Polish underground for secret meetings. A safe house, in underground terms, meant that it was a place that the underground knew that the Germans were unaware of as a meeting point once in a while for the Polish underground. Before we go on, let's just understand where we are. And I want to relate to, let's say, three concentric circles of the historical reality of where we are at that time. First of all, World War II. Second of all, the Holocaust in general. And third, where are we in terms of the Warsaw Ghetto? I mean, they're meeting in Warsaw. And two people who came from the Warsaw Ghetto left the ghetto secretly to meet this courier. First of all, World War II in Europe. We know that by this time, end of summer of 1942, from a military perspective, Germany was in big trouble. They had not defeated the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the US had entered the war, and even though the US had yet to send any troops into the war in Europe, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before millions of American troops would join the war, and Germany could not stand up to that coalition of allied powers, of the Soviets, the Americans, the British, Canadians, et cetera. They couldn't stand up to all of that. So ultimately, their chances of winning had been severely diminished. However, from the perspective not of a military expert or of any historian or even layperson looking back and saying, yeah, that's pretty clear now when we look back at it. From the perspective of the time, in August and September of 1942, Germany was still more or less at the extreme of its occupation in Europe. If you look at maps, I'm sorry I didn't include a map in the PowerPoint, but if you look at any map, you can easily Google this, of 1942 Europe, you will see that the Germans are at the extreme of their occupation, not far from Stalingrad, surrounding and besieging Leningrad, on the outskirts still of Moscow. They had been defeated in the Battle of Moscow, or at least they fought to a stalemate in December 41 and January 42. But they hadn't retreated far away from Moscow. They're still not far from Moscow. So they're threatening the entire Soviet front of breaking through. And they still control these vast territories all across Europe. And they're still threatening North Africa. The battles between Rommel and Montgomery are still raging in North Africa. It hasn't yet been decided, finally. And there's great fear that the Germans will break through Montgomery's defenses. And if they broke through Montgomery's defenses in Libya and Egypt at El Alamein, then it would be a cakewalk from that point to enter mandatory Palestine, where it was clear they're going to murder all the Jews. They already had an Einsatzgruppe, a murder unit, training in summer 42 with that purpose in mind, that as soon as Rommel breaks through, that's what they're going to do. They're going to kill all the Jews in mandatory Palestine. So that's the picture of the war. From the perspective of the ordinary person, Germany is still winning the war. In terms of the Holocaust, we know that systematic murder of the Jews had begun already in the summer of 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And we know that by this time, the systematic murder of all the Jews, the plan the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question, was well underway. And we know that by this moment in time, August, September 1942, somewhere in the vicinity of 2.5 or 3 million Jews were already dead. By the end of 1942, 80% of Polish Jews were dead. Around 4 million Jews in all, from all the countries, were already dead by the end of 1942. At that moment in time, between mid-August and the end of December of 1942, just in the area of Poland, of occupied Poland, that the Nazis called the general government of Poland, the area that included the regions of Warsaw and Krakow and Radom, Kielce and Lublin and Lvov, Eastern Galicia, those 5 districts, which is not all of occupied Poland, not even half of occupied Poland, just in those areas, more than 10,000 Jews were being murdered every single day between mid-August and the latter part of December of 1942. And what's going on in Warsaw? In Warsaw, we know that what was called the Great Deportation had begun on July 22nd, 1942. It continued until September the 21st, but the bulk of it was already completed by September the 6th. And in that period of time, nearly 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were deported to Treblinka. And nearly every single one of them was murdered within an hour or two of arrival in Treblinka. And in one of the ironic twists in all of this story, the Jewish underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto, most of whom were gathered around and working together, the unarmed underground known as the Onek Shabbat or Onek Shabbos in the Yiddish pronunciation, as they called themselves, the secret underground organized by Emanuel Ringelblum. One of the things that they were doing was actively all the time collecting information from everywhere in Poland and outside Poland of what's happening. And therefore, in this tragic irony, probably the best informed people in the world outside of the Nazis themselves about the Holocaust were the Jewish underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto. So here we are, that's the scene, August, September 1942, when Jan Karski met these people. And let me go back to the PowerPoint. who met him in this place. The people who met him, of course, didn't identify themselves by name, nor did Karski identify himself. He came with an underground name. I think it was Witold, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong in the name, but I think that was the code name he used. And they identified themselves, one as a Zionist, the other as a Bundist. And Karski described them. He didn't know who they were, right? But he described the Zionists, and the description was that it could have been many different people. An average height person who wore glasses, had brown hair, was middle-aged. It could fit a lot of Zionist leaders. But the Bundist, he said, he had the look and the bearing of an aristocrat. And he also had long gray hair brushed back and a big mustache, a big gray mustache. There's only one Bundist leader who fits that description, which is why we know who it was. It was Leon Feiner, who died shortly after the war of a heart attack. Karski understood as soon as these people identified themselves that something major was unfolding here, because the Bundists and the Zionists, he understood the politics of Poland, including the Jewish politics, very well. If they came together with a joint message, these two who agree on absolutely nothing about what should be done in the Jewish world or in the world at large, if they came together, then this must be something really major. And of course, with all the knowledge they had about the Holocaust and about Warsaw in particular, they were able to pour out their hearts and give him tremendous detail about what was going on. At the end of their first meeting, they met twice. At the end of their first meeting, Karski said, before they broke up, still under the cover of night, "I've heard your story. I have a photographic memory. I can relate the entire story in great detail, but what's your message? You came to give me a message to bring to the government and to the other people in the West. What's the message?" And apparently they hadn't really thought about that. The story speaks for itself. And then after some thinking for a moment, Leon Feiner, according to Karski's testimony about it, Leon Feiner said, "We want that after the war, no one should be able to say he did not know." And then they asked Karski if he would agree to be an eyewitness to the Warsaw Ghetto, and not only a hearsay witness about the conditions. And he agreed. And a few days after the meeting, Feiner escorted him into the Warsaw Ghetto. I want to read with you an excerpt of his description of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's several pages in the book that he published near the end of World War II in 1944, called The Story of a Secret State. And I would highly recommend that anyone who hasn't read the book, read the book. It's a page turner. It's really an excellent book. Only the last part of it deals with this mission to the West and the Holocaust. Most of it deals with his underground activity in Poland and all that. It's fascinating stuff. And of course, this is very gripping. He spent 2 days in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was escorted in one day, and then he came back the next day. Feiner is his escort, and they met another underground person inside the ghetto, and these two are escorting him. And here's what he had to say. Is it still necessary? He's writing this in 1944. Is it still necessary to describe the Warsaw Ghetto? So much has already been written about it. There have been so many accounts by unimpeachable witnesses. A cemetery? No, for these bodies were still moving, were indeed often violently agitated. These were still living people, if you could call them such. For apart from their skin, eyes, and voice, there was nothing human left in these palpitating figures. Everywhere there was hunger, misery, the atrocious stench of decomposing bodies, the pitiful moans of dying children, the separate cries and gasps of a people struggling for life against impossible odds. To pass that wall, he crossed the wall around the Warsaw Ghetto. To pass that wall was to enter into a new world utterly unlike anything that had ever been imagined. The entire population of the ghetto seemed to be living in the street. There was hardly a square yard of empty space. As we picked our way across the mud and rubble, the shadows of what had once been men or women flitted by us in pursuit of someone or something, their eyes blazing with some insane hunger or greed. We passed a miserable replica of a park, a little square of comparatively clear ground in which a half dozen nearly leafless trees and a patch of grass had somehow managed to survive. It was fearfully crowded, mothers huddled close together on benches, nursing withered infants. Children, every bone in their skeletons showing through their taut skins, played in heaps and swarms. They play before they die, I heard my companion on the left say, his voice breaking with emotion. Without thinking, the words escaping even before the thought had crystallized, I said, but these children are not playing. They only make believe it is play. Karski, with his memory, was able to relate what he had seen in the Warsaw Ghetto in fine detail pretty much to the end of his life. That's almost as though he'd been there yesterday. But this wasn't the end of it. The two underground figures from the Warsaw Ghetto asked him then, would you agree to be smuggled into one of the death camps as well? And Karski agreed. And in a remarkable story, as he reported, he was smuggled into Belzec. In fact, he was not smuggled into the Belzec death camp, just so we know what we're talking about. Belzec was the first of the gas chamber death camps to be opened. It began operating on March 17th of 1942, using carbon monoxide exhaust. And between March 17th and mid-December of 1942, 9 months of murder, that's how long it was active with gas chambers. In Belzec, approximately 500,000 Jews were murdered. At the end of the war, 2 are known to have still been alive. Not because the Nazis said, all these other Jews are terrible, but these 2 guys are okay. But of all the many escape attempts, these were the only 2 who succeeded in escaping and then surviving until the end after the escape. And one of them did not live to tell his story, but was murdered by anti-Semites after the war before he could tell his story. Only one lived to tell his story. He was smuggled not into Belzec, but into a kind of satellite camp of Belzec that was created in a small town called Izbica. And it was a camp which had a kind of holding pen for Jews. And Jews would be kept in a fenced-in area, thousands at a time, waiting for space to open up in Belzec so that they could then be loaded onto trains and sent in. And because it was just a holding area, they might spend a few days there, maybe a few hours, maybe a few days. There was no barracks, there were no latrines, there was no food, there was no water, just open air and waiting alongside a rail line. Karski was smuggled into there. How did these Jews in the underground do such a thing? Well, we don't know exactly, nor did he know exactly. But as far as we can tell from what he was able to tell, and from what we know about how the undergrounds worked, it seems that the Jewish underground groups kind of activated a whole chain of bribery. We don't know how many links in the chain there were, but each link, people along the way had to get a bribe that they were willing to pass on the information. All we know is who the 2 people at the end were. And they were a Ukrainian guard in Belzec and his sergeant, his commander. And the Ukrainian guard's job was to be Karski's size and leave his uniform at an agreed meeting point. Karski would put on the uniform and the sergeant would escort him in. Neither of these 2 people in Belzec knew who Karski was or what he was all about. He sold them some kind of a story. If they'd known he's there as a Polish underground, he's going to go tell the world, of course, they wouldn't have risked their lives that way. Karski was meant to spend a whole day in this camp, just as he had spent all that time in Warsaw, in the ghetto. But he didn't. He spent much less time because what he saw caused him to have a nervous breakdown. And I want to read with you here just a little bit of what he had to say that he saw. He saw people being pushed onto freight cars. And he says, so the 2 cars that he was watching from his vantage point inside the camp, the 2 cars were now crammed to bursting with tightly packed human flesh, completely hermetically filled. All this while the entire camp had reverberated with a tremendous volume of sound in which hideous groans and screams mingled weirdly with shots, curses, and bellowed commands. Right? The groans and screams are the Jews, and the shots, the curses, and bellowed commands are the Germans and the Ukrainians. Nor was this all. I know that many people will not believe me, will not be able to believe me, will think I exaggerate or invent. But I saw it, and it is not exaggerated or invented. All I can say is that I saw it and that it is the truth. The floors of the cars had been covered with a thick white powder. It was quicklime. Quicklime is simply unslaked lime or calcium oxide that has been dehydrated. Anyone who has seen cement being mixed knows what occurs when water is poured on lime. The mixture bubbles and steams as the powder combines with water, generating a large amount of heat. Here, the lime served a double purpose in the Nazi economy of brutality. The moist flesh coming in contact with the lime is rapidly dehydrated and burned. The occupants of the cars would be literally burned to death before long, the flesh eaten from their bones. And secondly, the lime would prevent decomposing bodies from spreading disease. This method of murder was not used extensively, but we do have a few eyewitness accounts to having witnessed this method of murder being used by the Germans. Yeah, they had burned the bodies, and the same substance is also busy sanitizing the car at the same time. Horrible stuff, which is why he collapsed after only an hour or so and had to be dragged out by the sergeant before he was discovered. Karski then met a second time with the same two representatives of the Jewish underground groups in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this time they came equipped with messages, say this to the Polish president, to the Polish prime minister, to the Jews in the advisory committee to the government, to the West, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he left on his trip. He left from Warsaw and went into Germany, went through Berlin, heading towards southern Germany, going into France. In France, he was met by a French resistance person. They exchanged codes in French. You know, one says this, and then you say that, then he says something, and you say something, back and forth to identify each other. The French resistance person escorted him to southern France, the free zone that's run by the Vichy government. And they were heading towards the Pyrenees Mountains, where he crossed into neutral Spain. While he was on this mission, the Gestapo in Warsaw had captured a number of Polish underground people. And one of those people actually had information on him about this mission. What was Karski's name for this mission? His name was Jan Karski. That's not his real name, but that was his name on the mission. And the other was a photograph of him. So now an all points bulletin went out to find him while he's traveling in October and early November of 1942 in France. At the same time, the Americans and the British landed in North Africa on November 8th of 1942 to seize the North African countries, the French colonies in North Africa. We're talking about Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. They succeeded right away in seizing Algeria and Morocco, largely with Jewish underground help inside those countries. It took them 6 months to get to Tunisia, which gave the Germans time, of course, to kill a number of Tunisian Jews and deport a number of them into Europe to be killed, quite a number. But they seized those two right away. In reaction, the Germans occupied Vichy France. So now in the scene, which Karski was unaware of, while he's busy hiking in the Pyrenees Mountains, while this is going on, there's an all-points bulletin, the German police and SS looking for this guy, Jan Karski, and German troops have occupied the area that he's now busy hiking through. But he made it over the border. He was met by a Polish diplomat, and now he could travel openly in neutral territory. He crossed Spain to Portugal. In Portugal, he went to a fishing village outside of Lisbon. He boarded a fishing boat, which took him out to international waters. A seaplane landed, and he flew to Scotland. And he landed on November the 14th of 1942 in Scotland. He was met in Scotland at the landing site by Polish diplomats who began debriefing him immediately. And he was true to all of his missions, the national mission, the party missions, and of course, the Jewish mission. And the fact that he was an eyewitness, an above board eyewitness, who's not a Jewish person who suffered trauma, and they might say, oh, he must have gone through something terrible, and that's what led him to exaggeration, but rather a neutral person who was an observer and is an official of an allied government of Poland, which is part of the Allies, he was taken very, very seriously. And the Polish government in exile, although they usually didn't overemphasize Jews, they did report about Jews, but they didn't emphasize the issue vis-a-vis the Allies. Here they did. This was one of the times, not the only one, where they did. And they pressured the Allies to do something with this because the Polish government in exile was not interested in having Poland turned into a slaughterhouse. And the result of all of that was that they succeeded, as a result of Karski's report and other similar information reaching the West at the same time from other sources, they succeeded in convincing the Allies to issue a joint declaration. I want to read an excerpt of that declaration with you. First of all, because that declaration, issued on December the 17th of 1942, was read out simultaneously by the three foreign ministers of the three major allies, that is, Molotov read it over Radio Moscow in Russian, Anthony Eden read it before Parliament in London in English, and Sumner Welles, the #2 man in the State Department, the Secretary of State, was ill and in the hospital, so his deputy read it before a joint session of Congress. Because it got high profile, it was on the front pages of all the major newspapers in all three countries. So here you have the front page of the New York Times. The next day, Allies condemn Nazi war on Jews. This is some of that declaration. I want to read excerpts with you. The attention of the governments has been, that is of all the Allies, has been drawn to numerous reports from Europe that the German authorities are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. From all the occupied countries, Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. In Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse, the ghettos established by the Nazi invaders are being systematically emptied of all Jews. None of those taken away are ever heard of again. The number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in many hundreds of thousands. The above-mentioned governments condemn in the strongest possible terms this bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. They reaffirm their solemn resolution to ensure that those responsible for those crimes shall not escape retribution. That's pretty powerful. And the Allied declaration here has details of the murder of the Jews to show we know what's going on. We'll make you pay after the war. I won't go into a discussion here of did they make them pay or not make them pay, but this is powerful stuff that was being said. Now, in the announcement of this lecture, part of what was said was that Karski was honored as one of the righteous among the nations in 1982. In 1982, in June of 82, Karski came to Israel. And during the time that he was in Israel, he was interviewed extensively, not only in the press, but within Yad Vashem by researchers. And you can read those interviews and English translation in Yad Vashem's archive. But he also gave two public speeches, one at the Synod Hall of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Mount Scopus, and the other at Yad Vashem at the ceremony itself. And he repeated the same story, more or less, but one of the things he did was that he reflected back. And what he said was, in his assessment, nearly 40 years after this mission, in his assessment, all of mankind at that time during World War II and the Holocaust was guilty of the second original sin. Now we have to understand what that means. Karski, to the end of his days, was a believing Catholic. And as a believing Catholic, he believed in original sin. An original sin is not only the act of Adam and Eve, the first sin recorded in the Bible, where they ate the forbidden fruit against God's commands in the Garden of Eden, and then they suffered punishment as a result of that. The belief in original sin is that all human beings, as a result of that, are born with a blemish, with a sin. And the way to atone for that sin that we're all born with, according to this belief, is through good deeds, and of course, baptism and belief in Jesus. I mean, this is Christianity and Catholicism, so that's part of the story. But what's important here is that original sin is built into the very creation of the world and of humanity. And Karski's assessment was that what happened in World War II and the Holocaust was of such great import, it's as important as creation itself. Second original sin. How was that sin committed? And he said it was committed, and I'm quoting him here, through sins of commission, of omission, or of self-imposed ignorance. That is, people who committed the crimes, those who killed Jews or accomplices to killing Jews, or of omission, the failure to act, to try to do something about this and prevent the murder from happening, or through self-imposed ignorance. Remember what the Bundes said to Karski at the meeting. We want that after the war, no one should be able to say he did not know. Self-imposed ignorance. Now, whether we agree with Karski's assessment of humanity in those days and second original sin or not is not the point here. The point here is that Karski is a very serious human being with a very unusual, I would even argue, unique perspective on these events. And when he reflects back and draws those conclusions, we have to grapple with that. And it's not a question we agree or disagree or analyze it differently. We have to grapple with that assessment and see what we think of it coming from this very serious human being. And I want to bring all this to a conclusion by reflecting on Karski's place in history and Karski and one last piece of the story. Let me begin with that last piece of the story. That is, Karski and his meeting with Felix Frankfurter, Justice of the Supreme Court in the United States in the summer of 1943. Because Karski's identity and mission were discovered by the Gestapo, his prime minister, Sikorski, gave him an order not to return to Poland. I mean, he was supposed to go to London and then go back and continue underground work in Poland. He was told, you can't go back, they'll kill you. They'll find you right away and kill you. So now you're part of the spokesperson's department of the government, and your job is to write articles and have speeches and meet people and tell what's going on. And that's what he did until the end of the war. And the book, Story of a Secret State, that I mentioned before and quoted from, is part of that larger picture of his activity. He went from the UK to the United States in the summer of 43. In July 1943, at the request of Felix Frankfurter, he met Frankfurter in the offices of the Polish ambassador to the United States in Washington. By this time, Karski had been asked, as he relates it, by many, many different audiences, a whole wide variety of audiences, had been asked specifically about the Jews. Because of news about the Jews being murdered by the Germans, being in the newspapers, and because of the Allied declaration, then they would ask him, so tell us about Jews. That wasn't the only thing they asked, but he said that many audiences made a point of asking that. And now here's Frankfurter asking the same. And Frankfurter turned to Karski at this meeting and said, I know all about World War II. I'm Roosevelt's personal friend. I get updates on everything that's on his desk. Don't tell me about the war. I know more than you. Tell me about the Jews. You saw them. You talked to them. What about the Jews? And Karski said that so many people had asked him about the Jews by the time he had met Frankfurter that he had learned what aspects of the story most interested them, and he had boiled down his talk about that to like 16, 17, 18 minutes of the main highlights that most people wanted to hear. And that's what he told Frankfurter. As he spoke, Frankfurter became very agitated, began pacing back and forth across the room. And then Karski finished his story, and Frankfurter continued pacing for 2 more minutes. 2 minutes of tense silence. He's going back and forth, and finally Frankfurter stopped, looked Karski in the eye, and said to him, when a man like me talks to a man like you, he must be perfectly candid. Young man, I cannot believe you. And Karski and the ambassador were taken aback, and the ambassador intervened and said, but Felix, how can you say this? My government stands behind every word this man says. How can you call him a liar? And Frankfurter said, oh no, I didn't mean to call him a liar. I merely meant to say that I'm unable to believe him. Someone who wanted to hear only about Jews, I'm unable to believe. Who want to understand reactions around the world, outside of the scene itself where the murder was happening, reactions in the West, etc., to what was going on, part of the story is this inability to believe that this unprecedented event was actually taking place. Part of Karski's importance and his place in history is trying to break through that difficulty or sometimes unwillingness, depending who and when we're talking about, to grasp what's going on. And I said that Karski is someone who is really unique in this story, and I want to close with that. In what way is he unique? As far as I know, Jan Karski was the only person in the world who was both an eyewitness to the Holocaust. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was in one of the camps and watched the horrors. He was also, though, an eyewitness to the reactions of Allied leaders to the Holocaust. He met cabinet ministers and generals in Britain and in the United States, and he met President Roosevelt ultimately. Searle mentioned this, the Karski is in the museum, and what's in the museum is him describing his meeting with President Roosevelt and Roosevelt's reaction. And he admired Roosevelt greatly to the end of his days, but his description of the reaction was not exactly, let's say, complimentary to Roosevelt. But that position of his lends him an insight into what the Holocaust and reactions to the Holocaust that none of us can have. Because he didn't just read what did they say and what did they write, he read their body language. And in that, I think we have a lot to grapple with when he assesses looking back. Let me stop there and open up to maybe any comments or questions people might have. Searle, you can maybe direct that, comments, questions.
Thank you, David. If anybody has a question, if you'd be so kind just to write it in the chat, that might be the easiest. And while you folks are doing that, I do want to mention that one of the people in our audience, Sir Ian Gainsford, actually shared a panel with Jan Karski. And Sir Ian, I wonder whether you might be willing just to say a few words about that, if you can just unmute yourself and say 2 words about that while people are thinking of their questions for David. You just have to unmute yourself, please.
David, first of all, may I say how impressed I was with your presentation. It really put in my mind a vivid memory of Jan Karski, who I sat with on one afternoon and one evening when he addressed a meeting at King's College, London. He was, he gave a very similar background. I mean, you've reported very much what he told us himself about his experiences. He clearly was a real hero. And I think he's very much in my memory, and I have a feeling that he will long be remembered as a friend of the Jews, and not that that was his intention. He was just an honest man, and I think that one has to realize that such men are really heroes in their time. And thank you very much, David. That was very impressive.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that insight of being on the panel with him. That's quite something.
And if I just may add, as David mentioned earlier, his heroism was, of course, recognized by Yad Vashem by making him a righteous among the nations. I mean, who would have risked their lives by going into the Warsaw Ghetto and going into a camp that was beyond comprehension? And generally, the Public Commission for the Righteous recognize people for saving Jews, and he didn't go about saving Jews per se on an individual basis. He risked his own life in order to create hopefully a situation whereby world leaders would save them. So it was a little unusual, but the circumstance was a little unusual, but he was certainly recognized when they realized that what he risked his life for. David, we have two questions. One is, Karski did not return to Poland after the war. Did he visit at a later stage? And the second question is, why was the Allied reaction to Karski's revelation so limited?
Okay, let me start with the first one. That's from Paul Lips, my old friend. Hi, Paul. You're right, he did not return because he was an anti-communist. And he did return for the first time in 1992. And after that, he visited, I don't know how many times, but he visited a few times. What's interesting is that Karski, because he wasn't communist, was totally erased from Polish memory, just like the Polish government in exile during the communist regime. Anyone affiliated with the Polish government in exile and any of the underground groups that were not communist during the war were fascists, imperialists, all the Soviet slogans, and therefore he wasn't there. I mean, we talked about him in the West, but not there. And then all of a sudden, with the collapse of communism, and the communist underground is no longer the only heroes in the story, of course. So then Poland nationally embraced Karski, both as a heroic Polish underground figure, even unconnected to the Jews. All the things he did in the Polish underground, he really is a hero. If he'd never met a Jew and had nothing to do with the Jews, his book would be worth reading, and his story worth telling, just because it's a remarkable story of all the things he did and was involved in. And of course, the Jews, and that was especially dangerous what he was doing, and especially heroic. So he's now embraced, and therefore, when you go to Poland, lots of places will talk about him, lots of universities, schools, whatever. There's a very impressive sculpture of him outside of the Polin Museum in Warsaw, which is in the area of where the Warsaw Ghetto was, very central place, and he's deserving to be there. So that changed in Poland. Regarding Allied reaction, that's a big and complicated story. I have a lecture I do sometimes for teachers and others in Yad Vashem that is 1.5 to 2 hours. So I'll now condense it into 60 to 90 seconds. And that is that the Allied reaction remained largely in words until a late stage in the war. Words of threatening the Germans and you'll repay, and condemning. There were various condemnations, not always collectively, but there were various condemnations of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews that came out of Allied leaders. We have to understand, though, in this picture, that at that moment in time, in December 1942, when the Allies issued the joint declaration, it's a question: is Karski really that? Until then, they didn't know, and at that point, now all of a sudden the penny dropped and they understand. And the answer to that, of course, is that was certainly not the first comprehensive information about the Holocaust that they had received. They had received comprehensive information already in spring of 42, not information about atrocities in different places, but about the picture. And it's not clear that they fully believed it then in December 42, even when they're busy condemning it. Of course, do they need to believe the whole story in order to try to do something about it is another question. But at that moment in time, even if the Allies, including the Soviets, had decided that, well, we must do something about this and try to intervene in some way, at that moment in time, all the Allied armies were too far away to do anything. They simply couldn't reach the scenes of the murder. There was nothing that they could do in terms of intervention. Could they have opened the doors to refugees more? Could they have threatened more? Could they have sent commando units in? Could they have? There are things they could have done. And of course, things they could have done later, when after more Jews were killed, but there were still some alive, right? So when I say that there was physically nothing that they could have done in December 42, I don't mean that as, wiping the slate clean and saying they're all wonderful and they cared with all their hearts, but Nebuch, they couldn't do it. That's not the story, but we do have to understand that that's a fact, that even if they had tried, at least at that time, and for many months afterward, there's little they could do. And when they could do more, 1944 onwards, of course, there were fewer Jews to rescue. And then there are all the questions about what were their priorities and how did they understand what was happening to the Jews. And it seems that by and large, most Allied leaders until the end of the war looked at what was happening to the Jews as a horrible thing. And none of the Allied leaders thought this was nice. None of them was dancing on the rooftops. Quite the contrary, they were horrified. But this was part of the larger picture of Nazi atrocities against many people, all people, and the way to stop all this is to end the war. Win the war as quickly as possible, and then you save as many people as possible. And they didn't really grasp till the end that the Jews are not the same story as everybody else. Yes, many are suffering terribly, many are being killed, but the Jews are not the same story, that there's an effort to kill every single Jew in a seek and destroy mission. When did they get that? And I remind us of Felix Frankfurter. All he wanted to hear about was Jews. When did they really get it? I would argue that they really got it only after the war was over. That doesn't mean that they couldn't do more. They could, but I'm talking about how they understood things and saw things. I see there are some more questions that have come up in the meantime.
Yeah, let me give you two, and perhaps you can combine them, David. First question is, what was Karski's response when Frankfurter said he couldn't believe what he'd heard? And the other question is, did Karski ever comment on the crimes of the Poles themselves?
Right. The second one comes from Mishpacha.
Edward Cohen.
From Edward Cohen, yes, who's close family. Anyway, the reaction to Frankfurter was surprise, but Karski let the ambassador lead the way. I mean, picture who this is. The ambassador is, he also happened to be a Jew. But the ambassador was a senior diplomat from Poland. Poland would not send a junior diplomat to be the ambassador in Washington. That's one of the most important postings. So he's a senior diplomat with lots of experience who was a personal friend of Frankfurter's. They gotten to know each other, they're friends. Karski was born in 1914. So here is this 28-year-old lawyer for whom the Supreme Court is kind of next to God in terms of what does it mean in the world of jurisprudence. And he's meeting a Supreme Court justice. He's in awe at the meeting. So, and he's 28, a young lawyer. So let the ambassador take the lead. He was taken aback, but he didn't actually intervene. He let the ambassador do that. As far as, did he talk about Polish crimes against Jews? Not in detail. He talked about, in his reports, he had extensive written reports in 1942 in this mission that are housed, if anyone wants to go look at them, it's all open access in the Hoover Library in Stanford University. That's where this material ended up, along with lots of Polish government-in-exile material. Not all of it, but a lot of it is there. And he did talk about attitudes in Poland towards the Jews, following up on that February 1940 report, and that there were many negative attitudes. He also related to other ethnic groups, Ukrainians, who were hostile to Jews and killing Poles at the time. So he related to that, but it wasn't the heart of the story, because at that moment in time, the main group of Poles, when he left August, September 42, that actually did something regarding Jews, not talked, and sometimes talked favorably about what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, but who actually did things. The main story about those actions are from the end of 42 onward. That if you follow the current news in Poland about the trial against two historians, Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking, who were found guilty in a civil case about libel, the stories that they're talking about, where Jews escaped and are often turned in by local Polish people, all those stories are from the end of 1942 until the end of World War II in Poland, because they're looking at Jews who escaped and are wandering in the woods, wandering in the fields, knocking on doors. How do the local Polish people in rural Poland react? That's their research. What are Jewish survival strategies, and how do local people react? So he would have actually had less to say about that when he went on his mission, because the main part of that story was beginning just as he left.
David, there's a comment here from Diana Polsky, who mentions that she believes there's a statue of Jan Karski at Georgetown University. She's wondering if you're familiar with Wojciech Pilecki. Pilecki was a Polish cavalry officer and intelligence leader who in 1940 volunteered to allow himself to be captured by the occupying Germans in one of their roundups in order to infiltrate Auschwitz.
Okay, first of all, about the statue. I don't know about Georgetown. It would make sense. There is also a statue of him at Tel Aviv University on the campus, in a central avenue on Tel Aviv University. I'm not sure why they put him in Tel Aviv. I'm trying to remember why. I don't know, but I mean, he deserves statues. So, you know, I'm happy that if there's one in Georgetown, good. As far as Witold Pilecki, Pilecki was indeed a Polish hero who did he volunteer, or was he kind of ordered by his commander to volunteer is not clear, but that's really not the main point. It's irrelevant, because he did end up getting himself, he infiltrated into Auschwitz, he got himself arrested so that he could end up being in Auschwitz, which initially was a prison camp meant for Polish underground figures. Among those Polish underground people, there were also Jews, but the large majority were not Jews. The first group arrested was 728 people gathered in the city of Tarnów and sent off to Auschwitz, of whom around 20 were Jews, the rest were not. And you know, that initially, that's what we're talking about. They're looking for Polish underground activists. And Pilecki was meant to go in there and see what's happening and report out, and then eventually to escape. He did escape. I believe he escaped in late 42. If I remember correctly, I might be off in that, but I think it was late 42. And when he wrote a report to the Polish underground about what's going on in Auschwitz, he also had a section about the Jews. And he talked about Jews being killed. The main part of his report was not about Jews. It was about everything else going on in Auschwitz, and mainly about Polish prisoners in Auschwitz. Now, Jews began to be brought to Auschwitz and Birkenau, in March of 42, late March of 42. The first ones brought in were from Slovakia, and then Polish Jews and more Slovakian Jews and other Jews were brought in during the course of 1942. But the main murder period of Auschwitz-Birkenau that we know of course, is 1944. Many were killed before that. But the peak murder period was 1944, with Hungarian Jews being brought in, and with them, the remnants of Italian Jews and French Jews and others and Polish Jews being brought there, Jews from the Lodz Ghetto, the last ones. So the most murderous period of Auschwitz was from mid-May of 1944 until mid or October or late October of 1944. That was the main murder period, when as many Jews were killed in Auschwitz as in all the prior period put together. So when Pilecki escaped, by that time, tens of thousands of Jews had been murdered in Auschwitz already. Tens of thousands. That's the lesser period of murder. It's mind-boggling. But he wasn't yet reporting on the Auschwitz that we know of that has become this symbol of the Holocaust. It wasn't yet that. But that's just putting things in context. Pilecki was certainly a hero, and as far as we know, was not an anti-Semite in any way, anything we know about the man. His escape, though, from Auschwitz was not an escape that was meant to tell about what's happening to the Jews, to rescue the Jews. That was one element in his larger story. And connecting to what I said about Karski and being an anti-communist, Pilecki was part of the mainstream underground in Poland. As such, after the war, despite his heroism, the communist regime arrested him and executed him in 1947.
David, thank you. You had mentioned earlier that even had the Soviets and the Allies wanted to do something, they couldn't have. And Ivan Goldberg has a question: what about bombing the rail lines or even the death camps? I know that you have a lecture on it on our site, and I'm not sure under what the tab is. Perhaps you can you can just mention how someone can find that lecture.
And our website is about the bombing of Auschwitz. I don't even remember what we called it, but it's the bombing of Auschwitz. If you just Google David Silberklang Auschwitz bombing, it should pop up with it, or you do it within Yad Vashem. It's on Yad Vashem's website and on the YouTube, Yad Vashem YouTube website. But in 1942, in December 42, the Soviet armed forces were too far away to reach any of the death camps. And the American and British armed forces, in terms of the capacity, the flying capacity of their air forces in those days, were also too far away to reach any of the death camps. They simply, and the rail lines, when we talk about bombing rail lines, that request came out when two Jews escaped from Birkenau in April 1944, Rudolf Rabah and Alfred Wetzler, two Slovakian Jews, managed to get to Slovakia, wrote a detailed report. The report was translated into German and then sent to the West, sent to the Hungarian Jewish leadership, but also to the West. And it reached London and reached Washington. And then they translated it from German into English in London and Washington. By the time it reached London and Washington, it came with a request to bomb the rail lines from Hungary heading towards Poland, towards Auschwitz, which the Allies didn't do, because by that time they said they'd stop bombing rail lines entirely. They weren't doing that anymore for any mission, because they found that bombing rail lines was very inefficient. It put bombers at great risk because of anti-aircraft, German anti-aircraft or Axis anti-aircraft, when they couldn't always pinpoint the bombing of the rail line. And even if they succeeded in bombing the rail line, the Germans, through their slave labor, they had endless slave labor, not only Jews, would be able to rebuild the rail line very quickly and go back to using it, so that the impact of bombing the rail line, the Allies found, was not really very significant. So they found other things to do in bombing missions. But that was a 1944 thing. In 1942, in December 42, the Allies were actively bombing Germany, just like Germany was actively bombing Britain. They were actively bombing Germany using British bases, but they could not reach the death camps. They couldn't get to Chełmno in Western Poland. They couldn't get to Auschwitz. They couldn't get to the ones that were further east, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. They couldn't get to them. And they also didn't have pinpoint information about where they were. But even if they did, they couldn't reach them. Not the Soviets, not the Americans or the British.
David, as the hour's a bit late, I think we have to wrap up now. And just want to share another comment that Hedy Jacobs mentioned, that there's also a statue to him in Krakow as well as in Kielce, which that sounds like it was something you just learned, as did I. Thank you so very much for a fascinating and extremely informative presentation. I think that it was quite gripping, and judging by the comments from the audience, I'm not the only one who found it a fascinating presentation. So I do want to thank you once again for taking the time and the effort to prepare this for us and share it with us. And I'm sure we're all far better informed about this person. And I would say not just informed. I think that Jan Karski was an inspiring human being, and he used his perhaps one might even say he used his religious faith to risk his life, because he felt that what he was doing was more important than his own life, and that's of course the reason why Yad Vashem recognized him as a righteous among the nations. And to me, and I'm sure that almost everyone would agree with this statement, the righteous among the nations were probably some of the bravest human beings who ever walked the face of this earth, in the sense that they were not only prepared to risk their own lives, but also the lives of their entire families, often for total strangers, just to do the right thing. And it's really, truly inspiring what he did and all the other righteous did. And it's a universal message, and a timeless universal message. So thank you once again for sharing this presentation with us, and we really appreciate it. And I wish everyone a good day, the rest of whatever time zone you happen to be in. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.